"Excuse me, sir. This line is for first-class passengers." Brittany's tone dripped with contempt as her laughter carried through the terminal. The man she mocked, Avery Montgomery, paused, his soft southern accent hanging in the air like an invitation for ridicule. Passengers glanced over. Some smirked, others looked away. To her, he was just another traveller out of place. To everyone's soon-to-be shock, he was the new owner of the airport she worked for. When the executives rushed in greeting him with deference, Brittany's smirk died. In one breath, her power vanished, and the lesson of her life had just begun. Avery Montgomery never expected to own an airport. Growing up in rural Georgia with his grandmother, after losing both parents in a car accident at age 8, his life had been defined by overcoming obstacles. His childhood home had a leaky roof, unreliable electricity, and was heated by a wood stove in winter, but it was filled with love and determination. "You're twice as smart as any of them, so you'll have to work twice as hard to be seen half as good," his grandmother Eliza would tell him. This wasn't pessimism. It was preparation for a world that would judge him before he opened his mouth and judge him again once he did. His deep southern accent, with its melodic drawl and distinctive rhythm, was as much a part of him as his brilliant mind and unwavering perseverance. At 38, Avery had built Montgomery Aviation Consulting into an industry powerhouse through sheer brilliance, grit, and strategic vision. His company specialized in turning around failing airports and aviation businesses, earning him the nickname the Aviation Alchemist for his ability to transform operational lead into financial gold. Despite his success, a corner office in Atlanta's tallest building, a net worth exceeding $500 million, and recognition in every major business publication, he still encountered the same prejudice that had followed him since childhood. Just last month, he'd closed the deal of his career, purchasing the struggling Westfield Regional Airport for $750 million. The mid-sized airport, serving a population of 2 million, had been mismanaged for years, hemorrhaging money and losing carriers to competing airports in neighbouring states. When Avery's team analysed the books, they found a gold mine of opportunity hidden beneath layers of inefficiency and outdated practices. Today marked his first visit as owner, but he'd made a characteristic decision: fly commercial into his new airport rather than take his private jet. "I need to experience what our customers experience," he told his COO Marcus Johnson, who thought the idea was unnecessary. But that was Avery, always thinking from multiple perspectives, always putting himself in others' shoes. What he hadn't anticipated was Brittany Collins, the 29-year-old senior flight attendant on Flight 1876. Born into a wealthy Connecticut family, Brittany had never wanted for anything. Her father was a retired airline executive who'd pulled strings to get her the coveted position after she'd grown bored with her marketing degree. 5 years in, she'd developed a reputation among her colleagues for her efficiency, her immaculate appearance, and her thinly veiled disdain for passengers she deemed beneath her. Flight attendants of colour had noticed how Brittany would check and double-check their tickets if they were seated in first class. Others had observed her mocking accents when passengers with limited English requested assistance. Small complaints had been filed, but nothing ever stuck to Brittany Collins, whose father's name still carried weight in certain circles. If Avery had known this history, perhaps he would have taken his private jet after all. But he didn't believe in special treatment, a value instilled by his grandmother, who'd raised him on a housekeeper's salary after his parents died. "No matter how high you fly, Avery," she'd tell him as she ironed his only good shirt for school. "Keep your feet planted firmly on the ground where real folks walk. Money changes addresses, not character." Her words echoed in his mind as he prepared for this trip. Eliza Montgomery had passed away 3 years ago, just long enough to see her grandson build his company, but not long enough to witness his greatest achievement. On her deathbed, he'd made her a promise: "I'll always stay humble, Grandma, no matter what." Meanwhile, at Westfield Regional Airport, the board of directors was nervously awaiting their new owner's arrival. Some, like Operations Director Dominic Parker, were excited about the fresh perspective and investment Avery would bring. Others, particularly board member James Sullivan, harboured deep reservations about the airport being owned by a black man, though he carefully couched his concerns in terms of experience and cultural fit. He's a consultant, not an operator, Sullivan had argued in a closed-door meeting the previous day. Theory is different from practice. And frankly, I'm concerned about how our more traditional clients will respond to the change in ownership. What Sullivan really meant was that the predominantly white business travelers who generated the most revenue might be uncomfortable with a black owner, especially one with a thick Southern accent that many Northerners unconsciously associated with lack of education. Little did they know that Avery Montgomery had encountered this prejudice his entire life. From his first-grade teacher, who expressed surprise at his reading ability, to the Harvard admissions officer, who'd asked if he was sure he'd applied to the right school, to the bankers, who'd initially refused to fund his first business venture despite his impeccable business plan. And little did Brittany Collins know that the man boarding her flight today, the one whose accent she would mock and whose presence in first class she would question, was about to change the trajectory of her career and her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The boarding process for Flight 1876 from Atlanta to Westfield was running 15 minutes behind schedule when Avery Montgomery stepped onto the jet bridge. Dressed in a charcoal grey suit that had been tailored to fit his athletic frame perfectly, he could have easily been mistaken for a professional athlete rather than a business mogul. He carried a leather messenger bag containing his laptop and the final documents for the airport acquisition, which he planned to review during the flight. Brittany Collins stood at the aircraft door greeting passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her makeup flawless, her navy uniform pressed to perfection. "Good morning," she said automatically as Avery approached. Her eyes flicked down to the boarding pass on his phone, noting the seat assignment 2A First Class. A barely perceptible frown crossed her features. Avery noticed it immediately. He'd grown sensitive to these micro-expressions over years of business negotiations and encounters with prejudice. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied with genuine warmth, his Georgia accent prominent but his diction precise. "Looking forward to a smooth flight today." Brittany's smile tightened. "Sir, this is first-class boarding," she said, emphasizing each word slightly as if speaking to someone who might have difficulty understanding. Avery held up his phone. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2A." She glanced at the boarding pass again, then at him, surprise briefly registering on her face before she gestured him through with slightly less enthusiasm than she'd shown to the white passengers before him. As Avery made his way down the aisle, he was engaged in an important phone call with his legal team, discussing last-minute details about the airport acquisition. "Now, William, I need you to ensure those environmental impact assessments are thoroughly reviewed before we sign off on any terminal expansion plans," he was saying as he reached his seat. He gestured to his carry-on bag and mouthed, "Help, please," to Brittany, who was now in the cabin assisting other first-class passengers with genuine enthusiasm. She pretended not to see him. Avery continued his call while trying to manage his bag and find space in the overhead compartment, which was filling quickly. "Excuse me?" he said, covering the phone briefly. "Would you mind giving me a hand with this bag? I'm trying to finish this call." Brittany turned to him with obvious reluctance. "Sir, if you can't handle your own luggage, perhaps you should check it next time," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. An older white man across the aisle chuckled. A woman 2 rows back looked uncomfortable. "I'm happy to wait," Avery said politely, still holding the phone. "Just didn't want to hold up the boarding process." "Well, we are running behind," Brittany replied with exaggerated patience. She reached for his bag with a sigh, then added under her breath, but loud enough for others to hear, "I swear some people think first class means first-grade service." As she lifted his bag, she turned to another flight attendant and mimicked his accent. "Well, I am just trying to finish my call, y'all." The other flight attendant, a younger woman named Melissa, looked mortified but didn't say anything. Avery pretended not to hear as he continued his call, but the businessman inside him took mental notes. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was blatant discrimination. From the cockpit first officer, Terran Williams had witnessed the exchange. A 15-year veteran pilot who had experienced his share of discrimination in the overwhelmingly white male cockpit culture. Terence recognized Avery Montgomery immediately. He had read about the airport acquisition in Aviation Weekly and had followed Montgomery's career as one of the few black executives in the industry. He wanted to say something, but knew from experience that confronting such behavior often led to being labeled as difficult or pulling the race card. Throughout the flight, the pattern continued. When the beverage service began, Brittany served every first-class passenger personally except Avery, whose order she delegated to Melissa. When Ava's tray table had a minor issue, Brittany told him perhaps economy would be more his speed on his next flight. When he asked for a pen to sign some documents, she tossed one onto his tray, rather than handing it to him as she'd done for others. Each time Avery responded with calm dignity, never rising to the bait, but documenting everything discreetly on his phone. He'd learned long ago that maintaining composure in the face of prejudice was both a practical strategy and a personal victory. They expect anger, his grandmother had taught him. Surprise them with excellence and dignity instead. As the plane began its final approach to Westfield Regional Airport, his airport Avery gazed out the window at the sprawling facility below. He could see the main terminal where inefficient passenger flow created bottlenecks, the poorly positioned cargo area that added unnecessary transit time, and the underutilized western section that could be developed to increase capacity by 30%. What others saw as problems, Avery saw as opportunities. And what Brittany Collins saw as just another passenger to belittle was, in fact, the man who now signed her paychecks. The plane touched down on runway 27 at precisely 11:42 a.m. As passengers prepared to disembark, Brittany made one final announcement thanking everyone for flying with them today. When she reached Avery's row, she added with a smirk, "Hope you enjoyed your first-class experience, sir. Maybe next time you'll feel more comfortable." Avery simply smiled and responded, "I suspect things will be different next time. You have yourself a blessed day now." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The jet bridge connected to the aircraft with a mechanical thunk as passengers gathered their belongings. Avery waited patiently, observing how Brittany continued to fawn over the white first-class passengers while barely acknowledging him as he prepared to exit. "Thank you for flying with us today, Mr. Kensington. We hope to see you again soon," she said warmly to the elderly man across the aisle who had chuckled at her earlier mockery. When Avery passed, she merely gave a tight-lipped nod, already turning her attention to the passenger behind him. As he walked through the terminal of his new airport, Avery's trained, I noticed at least a dozen operational inefficiencies within the first 5 minutes. The signage was confusing, leading to passengers wandering aimlessly. The security checkpoint had 8 lanes, but only 3 were staffed, creating a snaking line that impeded the flow to nearby gates. The food court was positioned in a way that created a bottleneck during peak hours. Avery pulled out his phone and began making voice notes, already formulating solutions. He was so engrossed in his assessment that he almost missed the man approaching him from behind. Mr. Montgomery. Avery turned to find Terence Williams, the first officer from his flight, now in the terminal, having completed his post-flight checks. "Yes," Avery responded, extending his hand. "Terence Williams, first officer on your flight," he said, shaking Avery's hand firmly. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened on board." Avery raised an eyebrow. "You saw that?" "Yes, sir. I witnessed how Miss Collins treated you, and I want you to know that doesn't represent our airline or most of its employees." Terence hesitated before adding, "I recognized you from Aviation Weekly's cover story last month, but I didn't say anything because you've been in situations where speaking up caused more problems for you than the person you were defending." Avery finished for him. Terence nodded relief, evident in his expression. "Exactly. In the cockpit, it's still not always." "I understand completely," Avery assured him, "and I appreciate you coming to speak with me now. That takes integrity." What neither man noticed was Brittany Collins now walking through the terminal, stopping abruptly when she spotted them talking. She moved closer, pretending to check her phone while straining to hear their conversation. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery," Terence continued, lowering his voice, "I was hoping we might discuss the diversity initiatives you mentioned in your interview. I've been trying to establish a mentorship program for young pilots of color, but it's been difficult to get support from management. I'd be very interested in hearing more about that, Avery replied. In fact, he was interrupted by a commotion, as a group of people in business attire hurried toward them, led by a tall black man in his 50s. "Mr. Montgomery, there you are," the man called out, slightly out of breath. "We've been waiting at the executive entrance. When you didn't arrive, we thought perhaps your flight was delayed." "Dominic Parker," the man said, extending his hand. "Operations Director. It's an honor to finally meet you in person." "The pleasure's mine," Avery replied, shaking his hand. "I decided to fly commercial to experience the airport as our customers do. This is First Officer Terran Williams, who's just been telling me about some interesting ideas for diversity initiatives in aviation." Dominic's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the potential implications. "Ah, excellent. We're very open to such discussions at Westfield now." He emphasized that now meaningfully. Behind them, Brittany Collins had frozen in place, the color draining from her face as realization dawned. The passenger she had mocked and belittled was Avery Montgomery, the new owner of Westfield Regional Airport. "Mr. Montgomery, the board is waiting in the conference room for our initial meeting," Dominic continued. "Your team arrived an hour ago and is already reviewing the operational documents you requested." "Wonderful," Avery replied. "Terrence, would you mind giving me your contact information? I'd like to continue our conversation about that mentorship program." As they exchanged information, Brittany finally found the courage to approach her hands, trembling slightly. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "I'm Brittany Collins from your flight. I just wanted to personally welcome you to Westfield Regional Airport and apologize for any misunderstandings during the flight." Avery turned to her, his expression neutral, but eyes sharp with recognition. "Ms. Collins, thank you for the belated welcome." Brittany's smile wobbled. "If there's anything at all I can do to make your stay more comfortable." "Actually," Avery interrupted gently, "the most helpful thing would be for all staff to treat every passenger with the same respect and courtesy, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived status. Don't you agree?" Brittany swallowed hard. "Yes, of course, sir." "Absolutely." "Excellent," Avery replied, then turned back to Dominic. "Shall we head to that meeting? I'm eager to get started." As they walked away, Avery couldn't help noticing the stark contrast in how people were treating him now versus an hour ago. Airport staff who would have ignored him before now smiled and nodded deferentially. Security personnel who might have singled him out for random screening now stepped aside respectfully. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nothing about him had changed except people's perception of his status. It was the same dynamic he'd observed his entire life, just more pronounced in this environment where his ownership was now known. In the background, Brittany Collins was frantically dialing her supervisor, Marion Reynolds. "Marion, I need your help," she whispered urgently. "I think I just made the biggest mistake of my career." Brittany Collins paced frantically in the staff break room, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. The gravity of her situation was sinking in with each passing minute. She had publicly mocked and humiliated Avery Montgomery, billionaire businessman, respected aviation expert, and as of 3 weeks ago, the owner of the very airport where she now stood. "Marion, you don't understand," she insisted to her supervisor, who had rushed over after Brittany's panicked call. "I didn't just give him bad service. I made fun of his accent. I implied he didn't belong in first class. Other passengers heard me. The first officer heard me." Marion Reynolds, a veteran flight attendant with 27 years of experience, pinched the bridge of her nose. At 55, she'd seen every type of workplace drama imaginable. But this was exceptional even by her standards. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Brittany, wave a magic wand and make him forget how you treated him." Marion's voice was tired. "This isn't the first complaint about your behavior towards certain passengers." Brittany's eyes widened. What are you talking about?" Mary sighed heavily and pulled out her tablet. 3 complaints in the last 6 months about discriminatory treatment. 2 from passengers of color who felt you were rude or dismissive, and 1 from a flight attendant who was uncomfortable with comments you made about a Middle Eastern family. Those were misunderstandings. I was just joking. Brittany protested, her voice rising. Were you just joking with Mr. Montgomery too? Marion asked pointedly. Before Brittany could respond, the break room door opened and Rachel Thompson, the airline's vice president of operations, walked in. Her expression was grave. Brittany, Marion, she acknowledged them tensely. I've just come from an emergency call with corporate. Mr. Montgomery's assistant has requested a formal meeting tomorrow morning regarding an incident on today's flight. Brittany felt the floor tilt beneath her. He's filing a complaint against me. Can he do that? Rachel gave her an incredulous look. Brittany, he owns the airport. His company is one of our biggest corporate clients. And from what I understand, he has video documentation of your behavior. Video, Brittany whispered, remembering how Montgomery had been using his phone throughout the flight. Yes. And apparently this isn't about a simple customer complaint. He wants to discuss, and I quote, systemic issues of discriminatory behavior and their impact on the customer experience. Marion closed her eyes briefly. So he's not just targeting Brittany. He's looking at our entire operation. Precisely, Rachel confirmed. Which is why I need to know exactly what happened from beginning to end. No omissions, no excuses. As Brittany recounted the events of the flight, each detail sounding worse as she spoke it aloud, a very different conversation was taking place across the airport. In the executive conference room overlooking the main runway, Avery Montgomery sat with Terran Williams discussing the pilot's ideas for increasing diversity in aviation. The problem starts long before hiring, Terrence was explaining. Many young people of color don't even consider aviation as a career because they rarely see pilots who look like them, and flight training is prohibitively expensive without support. Avery nodded, taking notes. What if we established a scholarship fund combined with mentorship from current pilots and guaranteed interviews upon completion? Terran's eyes lit up. That would be transformative. But honestly, I never expected to find support for something like this. Times are changing, Avery replied. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. Their conversation was interrupted when Rachel Thompson knocked and entered the room, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite her anxiety. Mr. Montgomery, I can't express how deeply sorry we are about your experience today. She began launching into what was clearly a prepared damage control speech. We would like to offer you our premium loyalty status complimentary upgrades on all future flights. N. Avery held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Ms. Thompson, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not interested in VIP treatment for myself. Oh, Rachel faltered. Perhaps compensation would be more appropriate. We could. What I'm interested in, Avery continued calmly, is addressing the underlying issues that allow employees like Ms. Collins to feel comfortable displaying such blatant discrimination. Because I guarantee you if she treated me that way, when she thought I was a regular passenger, she's done it to countless others. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. I understand your concern, Mr. Montgomery, and we take these matters very seriously. But I want to assure you that Miss Collins's behavior is not representative of our airline's values. Isn't it, though? Terrence interjected, then looked to Avery. Sorry, sir. I didn't mean to speak out of turn. No apology necessary, Avery assured him. Please continue. Terrence turned back to Rachel. I filed 3 reports about Ms. Collins's behavior toward passengers of color in the past year. Nothing was done. When I asked about it, I was told there was insufficient evidence and that I should focus on flying the plane. Rachel's face flushed. I wasn't aware of those reports. That's part of the problem. Avery noted, these incidents are treated as isolated, rather than indicative of broader issues. I'd like to schedule a formal meeting tomorrow with your senior leadership team, and I'd like Ms. Collins to be present. Meanwhile, back in the break room, Marion was delivering some hard truths to Brittany. You need to understand the severity of this situation, Marion said firmly. This isn't just about your job anymore. Your behavior could damage the airline's relationship with the airport, affecting hundreds of employees. But it was just one mistake. I've been an exemplary employee otherwise, Brittany protested. Marion arched an eyebrow. Have you? Because I've been reviewing your file and there's a pattern here that you've been getting away with because no one important enough complained until now. Brittany's phone chimed with a calendar invitation incident review meeting, 9:00 a.m. tomorrow, executive conference room. The reality of her situation finally hit her full force. What do I do? She whispered, genuine fear in her voice. You show up, you take responsibility, and you pray that Mr. Montgomery is more forgiving than you deserve. Marion answered bluntly. As the day's events unfolded across Westfield Regional Airport, the power dynamics were shifting in real time. Employees who had previously ignored or tolerated discriminatory behavior were suddenly concerned about accountability. Executives who had dismissed diversity initiatives as unnecessary were reconsidering their positions. And Brittany Collins, who had never faced consequences for her actions, was confronting the possibility that her career might be over. What would you do if you were in Ava's position? Would you push for Brittany to be fired immediately, or would you try a different approach? Comment with the fire her if you think she deserves immediate termination, or TE if you believe in second chances with accountability. Hit that like button if you've ever had to maintain your dignity in the face of discrimination, and subscribe to see how this confrontation unfolds in tomorrow's meeting. Will Avery seek revenge, or does he have something more constructive in mind? What would you do if someone who disrespected you suddenly discovered you held power over their career? The presidential suite at the Westfield Grand Hotel offered a panoramic view of the airport Avery Montgomery now owned. As night fell, the runway lights created patterns of illumination against the darkness, organized purposeful guiding aircraft safely to their destination. If only human interactions could be navigated with such clear signals, Avery thought. He stood at the window, bourbon in hand, contemplating the day's events. The initial board meeting had gone well enough. The executive team seemed competent, if somewhat set in their ways. The financial situation was exactly as his team had assessed, not dire but inefficient, with significant room for improvement. But it was the incident with Brittany Collins that occupied his thoughts. His phone rang, breaking his reflection. The caller ID showed Dr. Ella Foster, his former professor from Harvard Business School and now his most trusted mentor. "Elaine," he answered warmly. "I was just thinking I should call you. You must be psychic," came the rich, authoritative voice that had guided him through countless business challenges. "I just read about your acquisition finalizing today. Congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Avery replied, though the welcome was less than warm in some quarters. He proceeded to tell her about the incident on the flight, Brittany's mockery, and the subsequent revelation of her past behavior. "So now I have a decision to make," he concluded. "The airline is clearly expecting me to demand her termination. They've already offered me every VIP perk imaginable to smooth things over." "And what do you want?" Dr. Foster asked, employing the Socratic method she'd used throughout his education. "That's what I've been trying to determine," Avery admitted. "Part of me wants to make an example of her. Show that there are consequences for treating people that way." But Dr. Foster prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. "But firing her doesn't solve the underlying problem. It just removes one symptom while the disease continues." Avery sighed. "And if I'm being completely honest, using my position to get someone fired even justifiably feels too much like becoming what I've fought against my whole life. Someone who uses power to harm rather than help. You've always had a remarkable capacity for seeing the bigger picture," Avery, Dr. Foster noted. "It's what makes you a visionary in business. What would that approach look like here?" Before Avery could answer, his phone beeped with another incoming call. Marcus Johnson, his childhood friend and now legal counsel. "Elaine, can I call you back?" Marcus is on the other line. "Of course. Trust your instincts on this one, Avery. They rarely lead you astray." Avery switched calls. "Marcus, thanks for getting back to me." "Sorry it took so long," Marcus replied. "I was reviewing the employee handbook and anti-discrimination policies for both the airline and the airport. Interesting reading." "How so?" Avery asked, returning to his seat on the leather sofa. "Well, both have beautifully written policies prohibiting exactly the kind of behavior you experienced. The airline's is particularly impressive. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Commitment to diversity and inclusion. Mandatory training for all employees. Let me guess, Avery interjected. Great on paper. Non-existent in practice? Exactly, Marcus confirmed. I did some digging. In the past 5 years, despite numerous complaints filed, not a single employee has been disciplined for discriminatory behaviour toward passengers. The complaints are consistently dismissed for lack of evidence or categorised as misunderstandings. Avery wasn't surprised. It was a pattern he'd seen throughout his career. Organisations creating policies to shield themselves from liability while doing nothing to address the actual issues. What are my options legally? He asked. Multiple, Marcus replied. As the passenger, you could file a formal discrimination complaint with the Department of Transportation. As the airport owner, you could cite breach of conduct clauses in their operating agreement. Either way, they'd likely settle immediately to avoid publicity, and Brittany Collins would almost certainly be terminated. The airline would need a scapegoat, and she's the obvious choice. Avery fell silent, considering the implications. The scenario Marcus described would punish Brittany while allowing the system that enabled her to continue unchanged. It wasn't justice, it was damage control. His thoughts were interrupted by another call, this time from his executive assistant, informing him that the airline CEO, Richard Wilson, had requested a private meeting before tomorrow's formal discussion. After ending the call, Avery found himself reflecting on similar incidents throughout his life and career. He remembered being a 19-year-old college student working as an intern at a prestigious consulting firm. His supervisor had repeatedly mocked his accent, assigned him menial tasks despite his qualifications, and accidentally excluded him from important meetings. When Avery finally gathered the courage to report the behavior to HR, he was told that perhaps he'd misinterpreted the situation or was too sensitive. A week later, his internship was terminated for performance issues. That experience had nearly derailed his career before it began leaving him questioning his own worth and abilities. Later, as he built his business, he'd encountered countless subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination. From bankers who required excessive collateral for loans that his white peers received easily, to clients who requested someone else handle their accounts, to social snubs at industry events. Each time he'd overcome through excellence and perseverance, just as his grandmother had taught him. But he'd promised himself that if he ever reached a position of true influence, he would do more than just personally succeed. He would change the environments that allowed discrimination to flourish. Now that moment had arrived. The question was, what approach would create genuine, lasting change rather than merely punitive action? As Avery contemplated his options across town in a modest apartment, Brittany Collins was facing her own moment of reckoning. She sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through her social media feed filled with photos of her enjoying privileges she'd taken for granted her entire life. For the first time, she considered how differently the world treated her compared to someone like Avery Montgomery. Despite his wealth, education, and accomplishments, he'd been deemed unworthy of basic respect because of his accent and the color of his skin. Meanwhile, she'd coasted through life on advantages she'd never earned or even acknowledged. The realization wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. As the gravity of tomorrow's meeting loomed, Brittany Collins began to understand that the real issue wasn't whether she'd lose her job. It was whether she'd ever truly deserved it in the first place. The executive conference room at Westfield Regional Airport had been designed to impress with its 20-foot ceiling wall of windows overlooking the runways and massive mahogany table that could seat 30. Today, however, the grandeur only seemed to amplify the tension as attendees filed in for the 9 a.m. meeting. Avery Montgomery had deliberately arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a seat that allowed him to observe each person's entrance. He wanted to see their unguarded reactions, the micro-expressions and body language that often revealed more than words. Richard Wilson, the airline CEO, entered first, flanked by Rachel Thompson, and two men Avery presumed were legal counsel. Wilson was in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone unaccustomed to accountability. His private meeting request the previous evening had been declined. Avery preferred transparency over backroom discussions. Next came Marion Reynolds, Brittany's supervisor, looking professional, but visibly uncomfortable. She was followed by 3 other airline executives, each carrying tablets and wearing expressions of carefully cultivated neutrality. Terence Williams arrived, hesitating briefly at the doorway before Avery waved him in. "I wasn't sure if I should be here," Terence admitted quietly as he took a seat beside Avery. "Your perspective is essential," Avery assured him. "Thank you for having the courage to participate." The last to arrive was Brittany Collins. She entered tentatively, her usually confident stride reduced to small uncertain steps. She'd chosen a conservative black pants suit rather than her uniform, her hair pulled back severely, her makeup minimal. The transformation from the arrogant flight attendant of yesterday to this subdued figure was remarkable. Avery noted with interest that nobody from the airline acknowledged her presence or offered her a supportive word. She was already being isolated, the sacrifice to be offered if necessary. "Thank you all for coming." Avery began once everyone was seated. "I've asked for this meeting to address an incident that occurred on yesterday's flight, but more importantly, to discuss the underlying issues it represents." Richard Wilson cleared his throat. "Mr. Montgomery, before we begin, I want to express our deepest apologies for any discomfort you experienced. This incident is completely inconsistent with our company values, and we, with all due respect," Mr. Wilson Avery interrupted gently. "I prefer to start with facts rather than apologies. Would you mind if I presented what occurred first?" Wilson looked taken aback, but nodded. "Of course." Avery opened his laptop and connected it to the room's display system. "I've compiled a video documenting my experience yesterday." What followed was a carefully edited 3-minute compilation showing Brittany's behavior throughout the flight, captured discreetly from Avery's perspective. Her mockery of his accent, her dismissive treatment, her comments to other staff members, all were presented without commentary. The raw footage speaking for itself. The room fell silent as the video ended. Brittany stared at the table, her face flushed with shame. Richard Wilson and his team looked stunned, clearly having expected something less damning. "That's deeply disturbing," Wilson finally said. "Miss Collins, this behavior is grounds for immediate termination." "We will, of course, if I may," Avery interrupted again. "I haven't finished my presentation." He pulled up another file, a spreadsheet showing complaints filed against the airline for discriminatory treatment over the past 5 years, categorized by outcome. The pattern was unmistakable. Hundreds of complaints, 0 disciplinary actions. "Where did you get this information?" One of the legal counselors demanded. "Public records primarily," Avery replied calmly. "The Department of Transportation publishes complaint data. I simply cross-referenced it with court filings and internal records that became available during my acquisition due diligence." He turned to face the airline executives directly. "This isn't about one flight attendant. This is about a corporate culture that enables discrimination while maintaining the appearance of opposing it." Terence Williams, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Montgomery's experience wasn't unusual. I've witnessed similar incidents, repeatedly reported them through proper channels, and seen them disappear into the void." Richard Wilson's expression hardened. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Williams. Our airline has been recognized for its diversity initiatives." "Recognition based on policies, not practices," Avery noted. "I'm curious, what percentage of your pilots are people of color?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "I don't have those exact figures." 4% Terence supplied, compared to 13% in the general population and senior leadership. Avery pressed 2%, Terence continued. "One executive vice president who is Asian American." The tension in the room was palpable. Rachel Thompson, sensing the conversation spiraling beyond damage control, attempted to redirect. "Mr. Montgomery, we sincerely appreciate you bringing these concerns to our attention. Perhaps we could discuss a suitable resolution. We're prepared to offer compensation for your negative experience, along with a commitment to reviewing our procedures." Avery smiled slightly. "Ms. Thompson, I'm not interested in compensation. What I'm proposing is a partnership." This clearly wasn't what anyone had expected. Richard Wilson leaned forward, intrigued, despite himself. What kind of partnership? A comprehensive overhaul of how we approach these issues, Avery explained. Not just diversity training that checks a box, but structural changes to recruitment, advancement, accountability, and corporate culture. He turned to Brittany, who had remained silent throughout. Miss Collins, I have a question for you. Why did you treat me the way you did yesterday? All eyes turned to Brittany. She looked up startled at being directly addressed. She began, her voice barely audible. I don't have a good answer. I made assumptions based on how you spoke, I thought. She trailed off, unable to complete the humiliating admission. You thought my accent indicated lower intelligence or education, Avery finished for her. You made a judgment about my worth based on superficial characteristics. And you felt comfortable expressing that judgment because the environment allowed it. Brittany nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Yes, I'm truly sorry, Mr. Montgomery. What I did was inexcusable. Actually, Avery said thoughtfully, what's inexcusable is that no one ever taught you why it was wrong. You've been allowed, perhaps even encouraged, to believe that certain ways of speaking, looking, or being are inherently superior to others. He addressed the room at large. I'm not interested in punishing Miss Collins. I'm interested in transforming the system that shaped her beliefs and enabled her behavior. Richard Wilson, recognizing the conversation, had moved beyond simple damage control, leaned back in his chair. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Montgomery? A 3-part initiative, Avery replied promptly. First, mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, not the superficial kind you've been doing, but comprehensive education with ongoing assessment. Second, structural changes to recruitment and advancement practices to address the disparities Mr. Williams highlighted. And third, a complete overhaul of how discrimination complaints are handled with transparent reporting and genuine accountability. That's ambitious, Wilson said carefully. It's necessary, Avery countered. And as the owner of this airport and a major client of your airline, I'm in a position to insist on it. The implications hung in the air. Wilson glanced at his legal team, who nodded almost imperceptibly. And Miss Collins? Wilson asked, still expecting some demand for her termination. Avery turned to Brittany. Ms. Collins has a unique perspective now. She's experienced both sides of this issue, perpetrating discrimination and facing its consequences. That makes her particularly qualified to contribute to our initiative. Brittany looked up in shock. You want me to help? I want you to learn, grow, and then help others do the same. Avery clarified, starting with developing a case study based on this incident for use in training. For the first time since the meeting began, Brittany's expression showed something other than shame, a glimmer of purpose. As the discussion continued, outlining specifics of the initiative and establishing timelines, a shift occurred in the room. What had begun as damage control evolved into something more constructive, a genuine commitment to change, backed by the leverage of Avery's position and the moral authority of his approach. By the time the meeting concluded 3 hours later, the framework for transformation was in place. Richard Wilson, initially defensive, had become cautiously supportive as he recognized both the business advantages and the moral imperative of Avery's proposal. As everyone filed out, Terence lingered behind. That wasn't what I expected, he admitted to Avery. I thought you'd demand her firing and move on. Would that have changed anything fundamental? Avery asked. No, Terence acknowledged. They would have made an example of her while the real problems continued. Exactly. Avery smiled. My grandmother always said, when you're given lemons, don't just make lemonade, plant lemon trees. This is an opportunity to create lasting change, not just momentary satisfaction. As they left the conference room, neither man noticed Brittany Collins watching them from the hallway, her expression thoughtful, the first steps of a personal transformation beginning to take shape in her mind. 3 months after the confrontation in the conference room, Westfield Regional Airport hummed with a different energy. Construction crews worked on terminal renovations designed to improve passenger flow. New digital signs in multiple languages guided travelers more effectively. And in training room, Brittany Collins stood before 20 airline employees, her hands trembling slightly as she began her presentation. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that should have ended my career. She began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I discriminated against a passenger because of his accent and race. That passenger turned out to be Avery Montgomery, the new owner of this airport." She clicked to the next slide showing the video that had been played in the conference room. Watching herself mock Avery's accent still made her stomach clench with shame. "But this story isn't about how I almost got fired," she continued. "It's about how discrimination hurts real people, damages businesses, and diminishes us all. And it's about how we can do better." From the back of the room, Dr. Jasmine Carter observed with professional interest. As the diversity consultant hired by Avery to oversee the new initiatives, she had been skeptical about Brittany's role in the program. Putting the perpetrator in charge of education seems counterintuitive, she had argued during their initial planning session. "Sometimes the most powerful teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons," Avery had replied. "Besides, she won't be in charge. She'll be contributing her perspective under your guidance." Now watching Brittany present the case study they developed together, Dr. Carter had to admit there was merit to Avery's approach. The employees were engaged in a way she rarely saw in mandatory training sessions, asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences with surprising candor. When the session ended, Dr. Carter approached Brittany. "That was impressive. You've clearly done your research beyond just telling your story." Brittany nodded. "Once I started reading about implicit bias and microaggressions, I couldn't stop. I kept recognizing patterns from my own behavior, things I never even questioned before." "That's how growth begins," Dr. Carter replied. "Recognition leads to reflection, which enables change." Across the airport in the executive offices, Avery was meeting with Terrence Williams, now promoted to Director of Pilot Recruitment and Diversity Initiatives. They were reviewing applications for the first cohort of the Montgomery Aviation Scholarship Program. "We've received over 300 applications from students of color interested in flight training." Terrence reported, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. Many of them said they never considered aviation careers until they heard about this program. "How many can we accept for the first cohort?" Avery asked. "With current funding, 25, Terrence replied, "though I'm hoping we can expand once we demonstrate success." "Make it 50, Avery decided. "I'll cover the additional funding personally until we can secure more corporate sponsors." Terrence blinked in surprise. "That's extremely generous, but it's not generosity. It's investment," Avery corrected him. "Every talented person excluded from this industry represents lost innovation perspective and potential. We can't afford to wait." As their meeting concluded, Marion Reynolds arrived for her scheduled appointment. As Brittany's former supervisor, she'd been instrumental in implementing the new complaint handling procedures. "The anonymous reporting system is working better than expected," she reported. "We've received 37 reports in the first month, more than we used to get in a year." "And the response process?" Avery inquired. "Each report is reviewed within 48 hours with action steps determined within 5 business days." Marion confirmed. "The Oversight Committee ensures nothing gets buried or dismissed without proper investigation." "Any resistance from management?" Avery asked, knowing that changing entrenched systems often met with backlash. Marion hesitated. "Some, particularly from James Sullivan on your board and a few airline executives who see it as excessive regulation of employee behavior." Avery nodded thoughtfully. He'd expected this. Meaningful change was rarely embraced by everyone, especially those who benefited from the status quo. Not all the changes were formal or structural. Throughout the airport, subtle shifts in culture were becoming evident. Gate agents who previously might have called security on passengers who didn't look like they belonged in first class now checked their assumptions. Flight crews who once ignored or tolerated discriminatory comments now addressed them directly. For Brittany Collins, the transformation was both professional and deeply personal. Each training session she conducted forced her to confront her own biases more honestly. Each conversation with Dr. Carter expanded her understanding of experiences unlike her own. She began to see how her privileged background had shaped her worldview, creating blind spots she'd never recognized. One evening, After a particularly challenging training session where several employees had pushed back against the new initiatives, Brittany found herself in the airport food court, exhausted and questioning whether any real change was possible. "Mind if I join you?" a voice asked. She looked up to find Marion standing there with a coffee cup. "Of course," Brittany replied, surprised. Their relationship had been strictly professional since the incident, with Marion maintaining a careful distance. "Tough session today," Marion asked, sitting down. "How did you know I had the same group last month?" Marion chuckled. "Peterson and Davidson are particularly resistant. They've been with the airline 20 years and don't see why they should change now." "Exactly." Brittany sighed. "I don't know if I'm making any difference." Marion studied her former subordinate. "You know I didn't think you could do this. I thought Mr. Montgomery was making a mistake giving you this opportunity." Brittany winced but nodded. "That's fair. But I was wrong," Marion continued. "You've put in the work, Brittany. Real work. I've watched you study, listen, reflect, and grow. That's more than most people would do in your position." "I had a choice between growth or denial," Brittany replied. "And denial wasn't really an option after seeing myself through others' eyes in that video." Marion nodded slowly. "I've been with this airline almost 30 years. As a black woman, I've experienced my share of discrimination, both subtle and blatant. I learned to keep my head down, do my job, and not make waves." "I never knew," Brittany said quietly. "That was the point," Marion replied. "And that's what's changing now. People are starting to speak up, and more importantly, others are starting to listen." As they continued their conversation, neither woman noticed James Sullivan watching them from across the food court, his expression dark. As a board member who'd vocally opposed Ava's appointment and his subsequent initiatives, Sullivan saw the cultural shift as a threat to his influence and vision for the airport. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Richard, it's James. We need to talk about Montgomery. Things are getting out of hand, and it's time we took back control." While Sullivan plotted in the shadows, the transformation at Westfield Regional Airport continued. Imperfect and uneven, meeting resistance and setbacks, but steadily reshaping the culture that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked for too long. 3 months after implementing the new initiatives, Westfield Regional Airport had achieved remarkable progress. Customer satisfaction scores had risen 15%. Employee retention had improved, particularly among staff of color. The Montgomery Aviation Scholarship had received national attention, with major carriers inquiring about replicating the program. But beneath the surface of success, troubles were brewing. Avery Montgomery sat in his office reviewing financial reports with growing concern. Projected revenue was down significantly compared to pre-acquisition forecasts. Construction costs for terminal improvements had exceeded estimates by nearly 30%, and several key corporate clients had mysteriously reduced their airport usage despite the improved facilities. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered to himself. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Marcus Johnson, his legal counsel and childhood friend. "Got a minute?" Marcus asked, his expression suggesting the matter was serious. "For you always," Avery replied, setting aside the financial documents. Marcus closed the door behind him and took a seat. "I've been digging into those financial discrepancies you asked about. There's more going on than simple cost overruns. I suspected as much." Avery nodded. "What did you find?" "Evidence of systematic financial mismanagement dating back at least 2 years before your acquisition." Marcus explained, opening his laptop to share his findings. Inflated contracts with specific vendors, unexplained consulting fees to shell companies, and deliberate underreporting of maintenance issues that are now becoming critical. Avery leaned forward, studying the data. Who had authorization for these expenditures? "That's where it gets interesting," Marcus replied. "Most were approved by a subcommittee of the board chaired by James Sullivan." The name didn't surprise Avery. Sullivan had been openly skeptical of his leadership from day one, frequently questioning decisions and attempting to undermine initiatives. "I need more evidence before taking this to the full board," Avery decided. "Sullivan has allies who will defend him without irrefutable proof." I'll keep digging, Marcus promised. But there's something else you should know. Sullivan's been meeting privately with Richard Wilson from the airline. My sources say they're planning something significant, possibly an attempt to challenge your control of operations. Avery absorbed this information calmly, though inside his mind was racing through scenarios and potential responses. Keep me updated on anything you learn. In the meantime, we proceed with our plans. Across town, James Sullivan sat in an upscale steakhouse with Richard Wilson, the airline CEO, who had reluctantly supported Avery's diversity initiatives 3 months earlier. The numbers speak for themselves, Sullivan was saying, gesturing to a document between them. Montgomery's social justice crusade is costing us money. Employee productivity is down because they're spending hours in sensitivity training instead of doing their jobs. Corporate clients are uncomfortable with the new woke environment, and his renovation plans are financially unsustainable. Wilson nodded thoughtfully, swirling his bourbon. His scholarship program has generated positive press for the airline. Our board is pleased with the publicity. Short-term thinking, Sullivan dismissed with a wave. What happens when those scholarship recipients expect actual jobs? When they demand equal pay and treatment, the costs will far outweigh the PR benefits. What exactly are you proposing? Wilson asked directly. An emergency board meeting to remove Montgomery as CEO, Sullivan replied. I've already secured support from 4 board members. With the airline's vote, we'd have a majority. Wilson hesitated. On what grounds? Financial mismanagement and failure to fulfill fiduciary duty, Sullivan explained. The renovation overruns alone provide sufficient cause. We remove him, install interim leadership, and quietly roll back the most costly initiatives while maintaining the appearance of progress. Back at the airport, Brittany Collins was finishing her final training session of the day when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Walking past a partially open conference room door, she heard Sullivan's unmistakable voice. Montgomery thinks he can change everything overnight just because he owns the place. Sullivan was saying to someone she couldn't see. But he'll learn that some of us aren't going to let a southern boy with a fancy degree tell us how to run our airport. We built this place, and we're not about to let it be destroyed by diversity quotas and sensitivity training. The response came from Peterson, one of the resistant employees from her training sessions. The emergency board meeting is set for Friday then. Yes, Sullivan confirmed. By this time next week, Avery Montgomery will be nothing but an investor with no operational control, and we can get back to running this place properly. Brittany stepped back, heart racing. Her immediate instinct was to distance herself from the situation to protect her newly secure position and avoid getting involved in executive politics. After all, what did it matter to her who ran the airport? But as she walked away, images flashed through her mind. Avery's calm dignity in the face of her mockery, his unexpected choice to give her a second chance, the genuine changes she'd witnessed in both herself and others through his initiatives. She thought of Terrence Williams, now thriving in his new role, and Dr. Carter's passionate belief that real change was possible with the right leadership. She realized she faced a moral choice that would define who she was becoming. Could she remain silent while Sullivan sabotaged everything they'd built? Or would she find the courage to stand up for what was right, even at personal risk? Meanwhile, Terran Williams was making a discovery of his own. While reviewing historical hiring data for his diversity report, he'd uncovered patterns that went beyond unconscious bias into the territory of deliberate discrimination. Look at this, he explained to Dr. Carter, showing her his analysis. When you control for qualifications and experienced candidates with names typically associated with minorities, we're 87% less likely to receive interviews. This isn't random, it's systematic. And these decisions were made by Dr. Carter asked, though she suspected the answer. The hiring committee chaired by James Sullivan until Mr. Montgomery restructured it last month. Terrence confirmed. I found similar patterns in promotion decisions, contract awards to minority-owned businesses, and even which employee complaints were addressed versus ignored. This is explosive, Dr. Carter noted. Does Avery know? Not yet, Terrence replied. I wanted to verify my analysis before bringing it to him. "You should take this to him immediately," Dr. Carter advised, especially given what I've been hearing about Sullivan's behind-the-scenes maneuvering. As these separate threads converged, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of Westfield Regional Airport, but whether the transformation Avery Montgomery had initiated would take root or be uprooted before it could truly flourish. In his hotel suite that evening, Avery received a surprising message request from Brittany Collins. "Need to speak with you urgently about James Sullivan. Have information about planned board action against you." Minutes later, his phone rang with a call from Terence. "Mr. Montgomery, I've uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination in hiring practices under Sullivan's leadership. We need to meet as soon as possible." And finally, an email from Marcus. "Found the smoking gun. Sullivan's been deliberately sabotaging financials to create pretext for your removal. Emergency board meeting called for Friday without your knowledge. Call me." As Avery absorbed these developments, he didn't panic or rush to defensive action. Instead, he felt a calm clarity. The same clarity he'd experienced in countless business negotiations when he realized he held cards his opponents didn't know about. Sullivan and his allies had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed Avery's focus on diversity and inclusion meant he lacked the strategic acumen and ruthlessness needed to defeat a boardroom coup. They'd mistaken his compassion for weakness, his inclusivity for naivety. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. Friday morning arrived with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Westfield Regional Airport. Employees whispered about the emergency board meeting speculation, running rampant about its purpose and potential outcomes. Few knew the true agenda, a calculated attempt to remove Avery Montgomery from operational control of the airport he owned. The boardroom filled gradually. James Sullivan arrived first impeccably dressed and radiating confidence as he arranged papers at the head of the table, symbolically taking the position typically reserved for Avery. Richard Wilson and 3 airline executives entered next, followed by board members who had allied with Sullivan. Conspicuously absent was Avery Montgomery himself. "Shouldn't we wait for Montgomery?" asked one board member nervously. Sullivan checked his watch with exaggerated patience. "We've given him ample time to arrive. His absence only underscores the concerns that prompted this meeting." He nodded to his assistant, who distributed folders to each attendee. "The financial data speaks for itself. Construction overruns declining revenue projections, corporate client dissatisfaction. Montgomery's inexperience in airport operations is causing measurable damage to our bottom line and reputation." The board members opened their folders murmuring as they reviewed the carefully curated data Sullivan had prepared. "I move that we invoke Section 7.3 of the Ownership Agreement." Sullivan continued smoothly removing Avery Montgomery as CEO while maintaining his investor status. "This would allow us to install experienced leadership to correct course before further damage occurs." Richard Wilson frowned slightly. "This seems precipitous. Perhaps we should." The boardroom doors swung open. Avery Montgomery walked in, dressed not in his usual impeccable suit, but casual business attire, a subtle signal that this was not the formal meeting Sullivan had planned. Behind him came Marcus Johnson, Terence Williams, Dr. Jasmine Carter, and to everyone's visible surprise, Brittany Collins. "Gentlemen, ladies," Avery greeted them cordially. "I apologize for the confusion. It seems there was a miscommunication about this meeting's purpose and authority." Sullivan's expression hardened. "There's no confusion, Montgomery. As board chairman, I have the authority to call emergency sessions when circumstances warrant." As chairman of a subcommittee, Avery corrected calmly, "You have authority to call subcommittee meetings. Full board meetings require my approval as CEO and majority owner." He placed his own stack of folders on the table. "However, since we're all here, I'm happy to address the concerns you've raised, and several you haven't." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as Avery distributed his materials with calm precision. "You'll find 3 sections in these packets," he explained. "The first addresses the financial discrepancies Mr. Sullivan has presented. You'll note that the construction overruns he cites were primarily due to previously deferred maintenance issues that were deliberately concealed during the acquisition process by a committee chaired by Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan's face flushed. That's preposterous. You can't possibly. The second section Avery continued as if there had been no interruption contains evidence of systematic financial mismanagement dating back 3 years. Specifically, inflated contracts with vendors connected to board members' consulting fees paid to shell companies that trace back to relatives of airport executives and deliberate underreporting of critical infrastructure needs. The board members began flipping through the documents with increasing alarm, several shooting questioning glances at Sullivan. And the third section, Avery concluded, prepared by Mr. Williams and Dr. Carter, documents a pattern of discriminatory practices in hiring, promotion, and vendor selection that exposed this airport to significant legal liability. Liability that my initiatives have been systematically addressing. Sullivan slammed his hand on the table. This is a desperate attempt to distract from your own failures. Where's your proof? Brittany Collins stepped forward, placing a flash drive on the table. I recorded you, Mr. Sullivan, in the Sterling conference room 3 days ago discussing how you planned to remove Mr. Montgomery because you didn't want, and I quote, diversity quotas and sensitivity training ruining your airport. You also mentioned how you and others had been deliberately sabotaging financial metrics to create a pretext for today's action. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sullivan's face cycled through shock rage and finally calculation as he searched for a way out. Even if there were some irregularities in past operations, he began carefully. They preceded Montgomery's ownership and have no bearing on his current performance. And Ms. Collins hardly represents a credible witness given her own documented behavioral issues. Which is why I didn't rely solely on Miss Collins's evidence, Avery replied. Mr. Johnson has completed a thorough forensic accounting analysis verified by an independent firm. The results are conclusive and have been provided to the appropriate regulatory authorities. Sullivan's confident facade finally cracked. You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk damaging the airport's reputation with external investigations. I'm not bluffing, Avery said simply, and I'm not afraid of short-term disruption in service of long-term integrity. That's the difference between us, James. You see diversity initiatives as PR exercises. I see them as essential to building a sustainable, ethical business. He turned to address the full board. I didn't come here today to defend my leadership. I came to offer each of you a choice. Those who have participated in or knowingly permitted discrimination, financial misconduct, or deliberate sabotage can resign immediately with standard severance packages and without public disclosure of their specific actions. Avery paused, letting the offer sink in. Those who choose to stay will commit to the highest standards of ethical conduct and genuine support for our initiatives, not just public support, real measurable action. Richard Wilson, who had been conspicuously silent, finally spoke. And what about the airline's concerns about operational changes affecting our business? I've addressed those in detail on page 17, Avery replied. The data shows that after initial adjustment periods, efficiency has improved by 12%, customer complaints have decreased by 27%, and employee retention has stabilized for the first time in 5 years. He leaned forward slightly. The question isn't whether we can afford these initiatives, Richard. It's whether we can afford not to implement them. The room fell silent as board members exchanged glances, a subtle realignment of allegiances occurring in real time. Sullivan, seeing his support evaporating, made one final attempt. This is still a business, not a social experiment, he argued. Our primary responsibility is to shareholders, not social justice. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Avery countered. The most successful sustainable businesses understand that ethical practices and inclusive cultures drive long-term performance. What's failed is the zero-sum thinking that says we must choose between doing right and doing well. The debate continued for another hour, but the outcome was inevitable. By meeting's end, 3 board members had submitted resignations, including James Sullivan, Richard Wilson, recognizing both the ethical and business imperatives, had publicly aligned himself with Avery's vision, and the transformation of Westfield Regional Airport had survived its greatest challenge. 1 year later, Avery Montgomery stood on the observation deck overlooking the expanded terminal, now bustling with activity. Westfield Regional had just been named Airport of the Year by the National Aviation Association, specifically cited for its innovative approach to operations, customer experience, and workplace culture. Beside him stood Terran Williams, whose pilot recruitment program had already brought unprecedented diversity to the cockpit. Dr. Jasmine Carter, whose training programs have been adopted by airports across the country, and Brittany Collins, now heading the airport's Employee Relations Department and frequently speaking at industry conferences about her personal journey and the power of transformed corporate culture. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here a year ago?" Terence asked, watching a plane taxi toward the newly expanded international terminal. "I hoped," Avery replied. "But hope without action is just wishful thinking. It took all of us working together to make this real." In the distance, another flight landed, bringing new passengers, new opportunities, and new perspectives to an airport that had learned the true value of embracing them all. Lessons learned. This story reveals powerful truths about discrimination and transformation. First, real change requires more than just punishing individual acts of prejudice. It demands addressing the systems that enable such behavior. Avery understood that firing Brittany would satisfy immediate justice, but missed the opportunity for genuine growth and institutional change. Second, privilege often blinds us to others' experiences until we're forced to confront our biases directly. Brittany's journey from perpetrator to advocate demonstrates how awareness can lead to meaningful personal transformation when combined with accountability and education. Third, true leadership means having the courage to challenge entrenched systems even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. Avery's approach balanced compassion with strategic vision, understanding that sustainable progress requires both ethical commitment and business acumen. Finally, the story reminds us that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's also bad business. By embracing diversity and inclusion as core values rather than PR exercises, Westfield Airport achieved unprecedented success, proving that doing the right thing and doing the profitable thing aren't mutually exclusive. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your accent, appearance, or background? Or have you caught yourself making assumptions about others based on these surface characteristics? Share your experience in the comments below. What would you have done in Avery's position? Seek immediate justice or create opportunity for growth and change? If this story about overcoming racism and transforming workplace culture resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge our perspectives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that change is possible both personally and systemically. Thank you for joining me on this journey of reflection. Remember that true transformation begins with awareness, but only succeeds through consistent action and accountability. Until next time, keep seeing people for who they truly are, not who you assume them to be. Music